Then lovely, got lots of people starting to join us. Yeah, we'll give it a couple of minutes and then get started. Hello everyone, thank you so much for joining us this evening. We have got a chat which I now realise I can't see. So if you're joining us from somewhere near or far, let us know where you're joining us from. Say hello. Hi from Lisbon in Portugal. I'm hoping that you both can see the chat as well, yeah. So you can see who's saying hello to us. And hello from London. We've got a couple of us, both Sascha and I are based in London at the moment, so maybe you're nearby one of us. Yeah. I'm from Scotland and Bristol. Lots of people joining us from all over the place this evening. Very exciting. Yes, you are automatically muted, so you won't be able to accidentally talk. Right then, I can't see that anybody else is coming in just yet. We might have a few late stragglers, but are we ready to get started? Lovely. So hello everyone, I'm Kyaice. I'm publishing assistant here at the Emma Press, and you've obviously all joined us this evening to help us celebrate the launch of Accessioning. And on its, I realise I said 1 week anniversary, but I think it's 1 week anniversary was yesterday. Thank you, Sascha. So we've got our copies, which is lovely. And so this is Accessioning by the lovely Charlotte Wetton, and the cover was designed by Rena McQuarna as well, which is just so stunning, so brilliant. And so this evening, to help us celebrate, we've obviously got Charlotte, and we also have Sascha. So Charlotte's first pamphlet, I Refuse to Turn into a Hat Stand, won the Michael Marks Award for Best Poetry Pamphlet in 2017. She's a PhD candidate at the University of Manchester and lives in West Yorkshire. And we also have the lovely Sascha as well, who's joining us this evening, who's a fellow Emma Press author. She published The Whimsy of Dank Juju, her debut poetry collection. The Grimoire of Grimalkin, which I'm hoping I've just said right, was published in 2007 and greeted as a contemporary masterpiece by The Guardian, who named her one of the top 12 poets to watch. She's the author of 6 poetry collections and is an author, translator, and educator. And so we're going to hear readings from everyone this evening, so that we can help celebrate the launch of Accessioning and just talk a little bit more about poetry and all the wonderful things that I think we all really love. And so if I hand over to you now, Charlotte, just give us a little bit more of an introduction to Accessioning.
Yeah, we'll get onto the reading soon, but we just thought we should say a little bit about the books first for context. So I had loads of poems that I was putting together, trying to put together into a book. And it's difficult when you write poems about lots of different things to kind of make it coherent as a book. And when it sort of clicked for me was when I discovered the word accessioning. So this is a word that I've only known myself for about a year. And I came across this word, and it means accessioning is what museums do. It's a process that they do when they take new things into their collections. So if someone gifts them something or they buy something, they take that thing on board into their collection. And then there's all these processes that they have to do. So they have to like catalogue it and value it and insure it and all of those things that happen before it's in their collection. And when I read this word that I've never heard of, I was like, it's such a weird word. What does that mean? When I read the definition, I thought, oh, that's what a lot of my poems are doing. because when you write a poem, you're kind of deciding how to value something and how to remember it and whether you want to take it on board or not. And that's what a lot of the poems were about in this collection. And a lot of the poems were written in museums and galleries. And part of me writing the poem was doing that for myself and also responding to what the museum or gallery had done in that process. So that's why it seemed like the right name for the book. And then once I sort of found this word, then I suddenly realized that I had these poems that were connected and that did make a little book. And so that's sort of the background of the book. Really, it's just one word. It's just a one-word explanation, because I think that's what you do when you write a poem. That's what all poets do. That's what all people do. As we move through the world, we accession things and decide whether or not we want them to take up any space in our brain or not. And that part of that process is what this book is about. So that's my intro.
That was a really great introduction. I think the first time I came across the word accessioning was through your pamphlet. I would not have known what it meant. And I guess from the context that you'd given before, and I guess if I just saw what it looked like, I'd think maybe it's something to do with objects or something with museums, but I'm not sure that I would completely get that. Where did you say you kind of found the word? How did you?
I just came across it online. Yeah, because I had a lot of poems about museums and galleries, and I was sort of checking some of the names of the objects online that I wasn't sure if I'd written down right. And then I sort of, kind of went down that wormhole as you do on the internet of like museum studies and curation. And I'm really interested in the politics of curation, like why there aren't more women of colour in museums exhibits, like where are all those objects? They've all got lost. Why haven't we kept more of these things? Why have we kept these things instead? And so all of that kind of political background I found really interesting. And then how you display something in a museum or a gallery is, again, what we do as poets. It's like, well, what am I framing this in? How much white space is this taking up? If you put a single object in a big museum, in a big room in a museum, you're telling the people coming to the museum that this object is the most important object in the museum. Without saying a single word, you could just do that. And that's just the same as poetry. You're just saying, I've put this one word in the middle of the page. It's so important. This tiny stanza is taking up all of this white margin because I've decided that you should look at it this closely. And that's kind of what poetry is doing with the spacing on the page as well.
Well, just to say, I really did appreciate that about your book, and it's so interesting because the creative process is often quite magical. Like if you hadn't come across that word, but you did, and I did notice that about the book. I really do appreciate that idea, and I think it's very pertinent to right now what's happening in the world, with what's centered and what's not centered and what is accessioned. And there's quite a few poems in there that refer directly to that. So I really did appreciate that. And I hope we can talk more about that later as well.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you there, Sascha. I think just even you explaining the title, Charlotte, being kind of this single word captures almost everything that you're talking about and at the same time doesn't, and you can kind of explode it out into all of these many different things that are kind of all falling underneath it, but in slightly different ways. I really love hearing how you talk about gaps as well. I think would like to hear you talk a little bit more about it, because I think it's really, really interesting, something that poetry does that kind of a novel is maybe engaging with a bit less when you're thinking less about how it specifically is looking on the page, and it being more than just the words that are there and actually kind of how the entire space is working. So I think we'll now we'll do a couple of questions with both Sascha and Charlotte. So I have a couple of questions for both of you, and I guess you can probably already tell that we all have lots of things that we all want to talk about, so you'll hopefully have some exciting questions for each other as well, and learn a little bit more about both of your work. And so the first one, which I guess, Charlotte, you kind of already answered, and so, I mean, either of you take this one first, was I kind of wanted to know, firstly, why did you each write your books? Obviously, Sascha, you've written lots of books. I'm thinking more, I guess, about your link with the Emma Press, but please talk about any of your books and think about the whimsy of dank juju. But and kind of and what drew you to poetry in general, not just in these books, but just kind of in your careers as writers?
Well, I mean, it's been a really long time for me. It's been like almost 20 years. So I will say that that process, it changes so much. And even after all this time, you know, you have moments where you still don't understand what drew you to it or why you're doing it. And that doesn't have, that could have things to do with like real world implications, but after you've been so dogged about it for this long, it's no longer about, is it valid? It's sort of like, it's not about whether it's valid or not. It's like, I can't help it. You know, it's kind of embarrassing sometimes. Like, you know, with my family and stuff, it's like, what is it about you poets, you know? And honestly, that's still a very valid question, but I think more and more now, there's a need for narratives that sort of can give us something else, because we're so inundated with dominant narratives and dominant language. So, and this is why, you know, something like this accessioning, I found it, I mean, there's this poem, Charlotte, Slave Lodge, you know, Cape Town. And I loved what you've done with that idea of, you know, monuments and decentering and white space. And so that's really exciting to me. So in that regard, you know, having another narrative coming in that sort of decenters after everything we've been through with statues and you know, the so much has gone on in the last few years. So with my own book, I mean, again, it's just because I had to do it and I had so many poems. And the whimsy of dank juju in particular is, you see, I've always been sort of asked, you know, but what does your work mean? Because I take a lot of, I guess, liberties with language. And what's really interesting to me, that in the early days, nobody understood much. Like, that was the reception I got, was just like, oh, you're sort of an oddity. But now people actually are responding in a way that it shows the need for that kind of poetic intervention. So the whimsy of dank juju was sort of my step towards being a bit more in the because I've always been with like very small presses and sort of underground or whatever. So it was quite refreshing to be received that way, and by the Emma Press. So yeah, so I'm very roundabout sometimes, but yeah.
No, it's great to hear you speak. Sorry, Charlotte, go.
No, I relate to that thing of, I just can't help it, because I was thinking, you know, I've been writing for a long time as well, and you know, I've always made space for writing in my life as a little sliver of the pie of all of the things you have to do in life, and somehow that segment seems to have like got bigger and bigger and bigger, and it's like I didn't mean it to. It just, yeah, it's sort of taken over, and I think for what draws you to poetry. For this book, every poem in it I wrote because it was something that I wanted to look at. So it was something I wanted to look at really closely and consider for a lengthy period of time. And that's, for me, writing a poem in the same way that sketching makes you look at something very intimately and very truthful. So I used to do a lot of sketching. I don't anymore, but if you sketch a piece of furniture in your house that you've maybe looked at every day for the last 5 years, if you sit and sketch it, you'll never look at it quite the same way again, because you know it inside out. It's a really intimate experience sketching something, and it's the same with a poem. So if you really concentrate on something for long enough to write a poem about it, you've really considered it. So I think that's for this book, that was a lot of the reasons why I wrote things like the Slave Lodge poem. When I saw that museum, it just was such an emotional experience, and I wanted to kind of put my finger on what it was that moved me about that particular memorial. So yeah, so it's that close attention, really, I think, every time.
I wouldn't have actually thought about it like that. I really like the analogy with sketching as well, and kind of how closely you're looking at it. I kind of, you make me wonder, do you think that the kind of that closeness is that you see the object differently? Do you think that thinking about the fact that poetry is so much about language and how you're playing with language. And was, I guess, part of the conversation we started having before we actually started this, with Sascha asking questions and saying she's interested in thinking about how language is actually being used. Do you think it makes you stop and kind of think more closely about the actual words that you're using when you're then almost trying to understand the experience of looking at something?
Yeah, for sure, that's part of it, and really interrogating that language. So you know, the language of collectors, of archaeologists, like what they're doing with that language, that's in the book. But I think more than that, honestly, it's just the time. Like, it's just the time that it takes, the commitment to think about something for that long.
Yeah, it's true.
Yeah. So for both of you, do you think that I guess I'm not a writer myself, and I'm not a poetry writer, is that, I guess, when you look at some of the poems then being so small and short, and they obviously pack so much, but you think, oh, maybe you would have done that in a quick 5 minutes, or even some of the longer poems in both of your works, thinking maybe you just kind of got into it and got swept up and all of the words came out, or is that more of a long process?
I want Sascha to answer this first, because I actually wanted to ask Sascha a really similar question, which is about editing, because Sascha's poetry just strongly gives me the impression that it just leaps straight out of her head onto the page in one complete, you know, just instant flash. And I'm pretty convinced that that's not the case, but I really can't shake this impression having read her work. So I want Sascha to answer that.
That's such a wonderful thing that you've asked me. And you know what? I'm quite astonished that you're actually right, Charlotte. But nobody has ever quite interrogated that. I talk a lot about, you know, my affiliations with, you know, I'm a deeply sort of spiritual person, and I've like, you know, Buddhist, Sufi, all of it, like everything. I'm a meditation teacher. So I tend to look back on the beginnings of my poetry as interventions into like liminal space. And I strongly now, I mean, we have psychics in my family as well. And, you know, I'm a 3rd generation psychic. So there's a lot of, I myself would have always been not known how things they come as they come. And there's not much editing that happens.
Oh, that's amazing.
Which is just quite mad. It's like it's really nice to be able to say that, and you know.
Yeah, wow, that's amazing. Honestly, I can't get over that, because I was like, oh, I had this impression, but I was like, I'm obviously wrong. Like this, yeah, no. Wow, that's brilliant.
It's that flow, isn't it? You know, because I think I'm really into musicality, as you would know. And I think what happens, my process of writing is the same as music. It's like I'm composing it rather than writing it sometimes. And that's what happens when you're making music.
Yeah, that does make sense with that free flowing sort of tumbling of the sound echoing. Yeah, that totally makes sense.
And you?
Oh, well, I wish I could say the same. Mine's really slow editing process. Yeah, it's really slow, and definitely putting things away for a long time and coming back to them. There's some of the poems in this book, they've taken years, which sounds really like, oh, it took me years, but it's just they were just in a drawer for a really long time. It wasn't like working on them.
That is part of the process.
Yeah,
I tell my students this all the time, is that you need to put them away.
Yeah,
and something happens, like in your head and with the frequency of the poem, and yeah, it is part of the process.
And then you get it out and you're like, oh, it's got better since I put it in the drawer. Fantastic. Or worse, often worse. But yeah, no, it's definitely, and it feels like it's totally separate to you. It's like, oh, the drawer's been working on it, and then you take it out.
I love that. So like, how many drafts, for example? Like,
I don't know, depends what you call a draft. Like a lot.
Okay.
Yeah, loads and loads.
No, I love that. Drafts, I'm a big proponent of drafts, actually, because, you know, I'm also a fiction writer, and I feel like drafts are a lot of the time where magic happens, you know, if you can let go if you can, you know, approach the draft in that way, it's part of the process, frankly.
And I've learned that you can actually ruin a poem as well if you try and write it too fast. So I have also done that. If you talk about it too much to too many people, you like waste all the words that you should have been putting on the paper. And if you try and like push through and like hammer through, you're like, I'm going to finish this poem this week. Yeah, I have ruined poems to the point where you can't go back and edit them better. Like you can't go back to a previous draft because you kind of used up. I guess you've used up your enthusiasm for the topic, or you've used up your headspace for the topic, and it's kind of run out. So yeah, I've just decided I'm just going to write really slowly forever, and that's just what's going to be.
Yeah, hell yeah. I mean, I did this whole process, this one set of poems. I got obsessed with. I had read Yusuf Komunyaka's Talking Dirty to the Gods, which had these very specific forms he had created, and I decided to do this experiment where I'd have one word and then I would sit there until the next word, and it was just word by word came to me, and I couldn't use any, like, it was a whole complicated process. But and the whole point of that was time. So I think that's interesting. Yeah, I think that's perfectly acceptable. Also, drawing words out of a hat, that can also work.
Yeah, I'm not immune to a bit of thesaurus usage. Yeah.
Don't. You read the grimoire. You read my first book. Wow. That has made me so happy. You know, a lot of thesauruses went into the making.
Yeah. But I love it. Yeah.
I have heard that one of the ways to kind of get somewhere, this was a practice that we did as a team, was like you take a word and then think of as many words that you could use to say that and get as far away as possible from the word that you began with. Sounds a bit like pulling words out of a hat as well.
That's a great game.
I love that. Yeah. You'll be surprised, and I'm sure, I mean, there may be people here, but like my students, they've never seen thesauruses, you know, like
like real paper ones.
Yeah, and like I never even knew they existed, Charlotte, not even paper ones. But I've had to like tell people what, and I'm not saying it like in an arrogant way, I just mean as in the way the world has changed, you know, and the things that people who've grown up, you know, completely with the digital reality, you know, and also books. I meet people who haven't read books. This is why what we do is important, perhaps, I hope. Keep books alive.
I guess on the digital front, with you talking about having a hardback thesaurus, of which I've also never seen one, I'm maybe ashamed to say. But I wonder, with both of you writing, I feel like maybe I already know the answer, but do you think that you do write on paper? Is that something that's important for the kind of imagining the sketching with you with the pencil, kind of trying to work things out, Charlotte? Or can that be done digitally? Is that, how do you approach it?
Yeah, for me, they're two really different things. So it's quite important. And I don't want to be fetishistic about it, because I think, you know, people write poems in prison on their bed sheets. So I don't want to get all like arty-farty about it. But for me, I always do first drafts on paper, and I try and keep it on paper for as long as possible. So the moment when I put it onto the laptop is basically the moment that I've decided it's going to be a poem. Like up until that, like all the balls are in play, and it might be like, which is not to say it doesn't change a lot afterwards, but it's a commitment putting the words on the screen, because a Word document is so clean and neat, and it therefore intimidating, that I try to avoid it as much as possible. But then you can use that to your advantage. So then when you've got your draft, you know, probably quite a late draft for me of the poem on the Word document, you then can use all that like intensity of like the really, really shiny whiteness of the page and the really blackness of the ink, And then you can use that for editing. So every comma stands out really clearly on a Word document, you know, more than when if it's handwritten. The length is much easier to see the length of the line on a Word document than on a notepad. So, you know, it's much more precise. So you kind of then channel that really precision for the editing process. So someone, I think this is like someone really famous, like Ted Hughes or someone, said there's like the red eye of creation and the blue cold eye of the edit. And that's, for me, that's like the paper and the screen. And the Word document is like that intimidating blue eye of, this needs to be perfect, edit it well, edit it again. And then the notebook is like the fun bit. Well, not that the other bit's not fun, but it's like the messy bit. The messy bit is the notebook. And I've now started, I started this a couple of years ago and it was revolutionary. I now only write in notebooks from the back. So that's just, I find that so liberating, because it's like what I'm writing down is so unimportant that I'm just going to hide it in the back of this notebook. And then sometimes I use the front of the notebook to like write out a full draft, like an early draft, and sort of look at it. But anything that's like an idea or a phrase or something you're experimenting with, I just hide it away at the back and pretend that it's not there, because it's just it's always an experiment. If you don't keep experimenting, there's no point really. So you've got to kind of trick your brain into that what you're doing is trivial and unimportant and you don't care about it, and then a better idea might come along.
Wow, I really love the way you've described that. It's very organic, it's very intuitive, and I can't recommend that sort of method more. You know, sometimes I feel like I'm in a losing battle because I go on and on about handwriting. And lately, in the last maybe 5 years, I had this like rebellion against the machine, and a lot of my new stuff has been handwritten, and bless those publishers, they're like, oh yeah, we'll publish it handwritten. I was like, I refuse to, I'm not transcribing it. Because also because of the world we're living in, going back to that and hearing people actually tell me that they've forgotten how to handwrite, I get a panic attack. Like I can't help it. I can't bear this idea of our opposable thumbs not be, you know, it's like, what do you mean you've forgotten how to write? Like, no, but also it has much deeper roots, to be honest, you know, between the hand and the mind, that connection, it's a very different connection of the fingers.
Yeah, I think it is.
It is. And
I don't know why or how, but I think it is.
Oh, you can look at it's like got mystical, you know, explanations. It's got somatic, you know, it's got so many, and actually intuitively it makes complete sense. You know, it's got to do with breath and body. It's got to do with like embodied poetics. And, you know, now that you've told me that, I really do see that in your work. It's that your poetics are very embodied. And that was something I noticed actually immediately. And I think the attention to breath, you know, when you're with hand is completely different.
Because you have to say the line. So if you're writing a line, you're sort of thinking about how long is this going to take? Can I do this in one breath? Is this 2 breaths? Is it a deep breath? Yeah. So like I'm not consciously thinking that, but probably you know, like this is taking a long time to write this line, you know, this is going to be a long breath. You kind of just know that.
Yeah, sorry, I had to sit down, my back was hurting. But then I do also then recommend, of course, exactly what you said, like transcribing it into the machine. That, I mean, I also have those poems. Yes, there are the ones that are handwritten, but there's also, but actually that said, my new book that's coming out is all my visual poetry that I got to make, like poetry emblems, and it's all very exciting. But that you do need to transcribe if that is what you're doing, for sure. And then you can play with it, you know, you play with where things sit, and it can all come into focus a lot more, because your own handwriting can also be so it's too much of you.
Too familiar, yeah. So it kind of defamiliarizes it when you put it on screen.
Exactly.
And some people do this editing thing where they like put it in a different font or a different color. So it's like, oh, surprise, blue poem in Arial, like that. To trick your brain to look at it afresh. Yeah.
I think the tricking your brain thing is so spot on. That whole thing about the back of the book, it's true, because we get what you've talked about, though, it also has a lot to do with anxiety and well-being. You know, we as writers don't talk enough about how anxious our writing can make us. So I love the tricking the brain thing. I do that. I have to trick myself all the time.
Before we get into some readings, just with you talking about tricking the brain, something that I've been told to edit, this is different because I'm editing like essays, is to edit them from the bottom up. And so kind of read the whole thing backwards, basically. Is that something that you've ever tried? Thinking it's obviously slightly different with a poem, but read it from the bottom line up. I guess I'm thinking more in editing, but also just in general.
I'm going to try it now that you said that. I don't think I have tried that. Yeah, good suggestion.
100%. And, you know, with prose as well, and actually with poetry as well, and what, because, you know, I do a lot of I teach at the poetry school as well, and that's all editing and feedback. And some of my more radical editing suggestions literally involve taking chunks and moving them around arbitrarily, because and that 100% works with essays, with fiction, because the sense that we think we're making is not actually the sense that the piece is making. And sometimes you've said the thing that needs to, it takes practice. It takes practice, and it's scary for sure, but I really do agree with that. Yeah.
Right then, well, we've been talking all about the practice, so maybe now time to hear a bit about I'm reluctant to maybe say finished product. I feel like there are issues with that maybe, but what's on the page.
What we've decided to go with.
Yeah, what's finally been printed, but maybe not its finished product. And so, Sascha, if you're happy to kick us off, maybe read some poems for us. I'll turn my camera off my mic so you don't have to see any more of me.
I feel really weird when the faces disappear, to be honest. It feels very isolating. But okay, so this is my Emma Press book. It came out a few years ago, Whimsy of Dank Juju. It was my first pamphlet after a number of collections, and also a deck that I published, a deck of visual poems. So I will read a few. I'll just start from, that conversation has me just thinking about so many things. Okay, let's go with the more magic-y type of stuff that's fun to read. So this is called Chaos Totem. If it is condors in the night sky, a gilded wooing eruption in the Empress way of stars, I hear each bar of the xylophone beaten by their wings, battling the atmosphere. A wish to pass behind the firewall, you. If it is fire starters in the dim, in the cavernous, in the ruins of the day, a pacing, piercing undulation rippling under the skin. I feel each dig of the claws of the panther puncturing my lungs to a paler, slivered shadow of breath. Your smile glowing in the tint of a nuclear sun, the dream of red letters every night, new. If it is angels of mercy unfurling ragged wings on runny skies, I see Sophia's paintings dripping on my head, and each prayer wheel spins in the temples of Kathmandu. Furiously, yellow-bellied pigeons fall over from lack of oxygen.
Eggs are fried on the bonnets of cars, and I hear the Noctiluca roaring of its hunger. If it is, I draw the line, I choke the hold on time, and supply runs short. Shoals of unborns playing tantras with wooden legs on tankers, crying, carrying oil explode and melt the very tar soul of the road. And you must run for your very, very life. Thank you. I'll just read a few more, because I really do, I'm excited to listen to Charlotte. I'll read this. This poem is quite exciting, you know, as a person involved in ideas of decentering. And, you know, when I started, I was really the only non-white poet on the scene that I came across. Like, I never came across anyone. So I've had there's a lot of things I battle, you know, and in my own work as well. And you know, voices being heard is one of them. But this poem was included in an A-level magazine, which I felt was like, you know, a huge coup for this side, for this brown girl. And they went so far as to say it reminded them of Midsummer Night's Dream. So with the fairy, buttercream yellow walls of rain whistling like flowers, heather wings hang on silken threads, falling as a rope ladder to the moon. Drifting amidst the ocular cloud towers, arms tower, head is a large glass bulb. Planted in the rooftop of the world is where we dance a melange of songboats and aquamarine. Wiser for lakes of folklore unfold secret microcosms of universe. I pare apples and dangle the peels in my hair, romantic notions of howling wildebeests, shining in Swedish ultra sway night, remembered because of which I am. Who is hearing wild dogs barking? It enters me, and if we followed you all night, we'd arrive at day. Is it the time? Yeah.
That was brilliant. I think that was fantastic hearing you read. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you so much. Yeah.
I read some of the Whimsy of Dang Juju actually on my laptop, because I sadly don't have the physical copy, and wished that I did. So I thought it was just fantastic. And I think I say this to almost everyone that I hear read, but I really do mean it, that I think there is so much power in actually hearing you speak it. I think kind of just how you're playing with sound is so much clearer versus me kind of trying to do it while reading it in my head and it just not working in the same way.
Yeah, I agree about that for all poetry. After all, it was always an oral tradition, you know. But thank you. Yeah.
So Charlotte, if you
are you coming back?
Yeah.
I'm back.
Yay.
Thank you, Sasha. I really enjoyed that. Yeah, it is lovely to hear it out loud.
Thank you, Charlotte.
So if there's nothing that either of you want to say, I think we'll move on to hearing from Charlotte, if you're ready to speak for us.
Yeah. So I'm going to start from reading a poem that's quite near the back of the book. There's quite a few near the back that are really about that kind of valuing thing that I mentioned earlier, about how we decide what and how to remember. So this poem is called Rag. The dead women are laid to rest in filing cabinets. They wash down windows with vinegar. The dead women, folded inside a man's shoes, give him that extra inch. The dead women thicken the plot, kill wasps and reflect badly on the department. The dead women are lit spills. They are a mobile of planets hanging from the ceiling of Class 3B as part of their space project. The dead women become overnight celebrities, get recycled, line rabbit hutches, and run for weeks. They keep the glass flush on a framed print of Krishna and the gopis. They are carpet backing and beginners origami. They are a clever red herring, dressmaker's cutouts, a money spinner, and wrap fish. The dead women lie on the dashboard of a white van in the sun, and the dead women had it coming. Tied with string, they cover fruitcake in a cool oven. The dead women hold broken glass, then twirl downstream as tiny boats. They flatten themselves on the chimney breast, and the fire draws. The dead women need cataloguing. The dead women slide off the seats and litter the train. The dead women blow in the wind. The next poem I wrote sitting on the floor in Manchester Museum. One of the downsides of writing poems in museums is that there's not always a chair just where you want it to be. I have now lost the poem. I've forgotten what order I've put them in, having spent so long ordering this pamphlet. Ordering a pamphlet is a joy. It's an absolute joy for about an hour and a half. And after that, it's a complete nightmare. There's no middle ground. Okay. So this one's from Manchester Museum and it's called Exhibit A.2412.331, Sloth Skeleton. 2 curators, palm cup his skull, cradle the descant of his spine. Gently they lift and loop his elegant hooked toes to a perspex cross. Swung supine, small as a child, he is fretwork, unfleshed, an armful of air, snappable. Stripped to articulated mechanics, jointings and engines, load-bearing carabiner claws, exacting requirements gleam warm white. The curators are skilled, trained, and the need for conservation axiomatic. Easily they cherish his clean bones, and in the quiet museum tongue his soft name, sibilant hiss of Eden, thick plummet of felled forest, his muzzle turned to the wall. This next poem, I was really privileged to be shown this exhibit by the curator of the museum, which I would highly recommend to anyone. And she told me about this exhibit and she took me over. And it's about an incident that happened in the Byzantine Empire, so really topical. And she told me this story and I was like immediately gripped by this kind of journalistic desire to tell this story. And then, as often happens with poems, you start getting more interested in the language than the story. This is one of the ones that I got really into, borrowing language and thinking about how language is used in this particular context in order to know what we know. So really the kind of epistemological function of language. So it's called The Cave Precipice of Andritsa, and Andritsa is a place in Greece. In the last quarter of the 6th century AD, 33 Christians, mostly women and children, descended 14 meters to the cave precipice of Andritsa. The difficulty of access implies irregular use. They had buckles and needles and lamps, amphorae for water and oil, numerous coins, a goat for milk. Coin hoards are indicative of political instability. They had earrings and brooches and rings and a bronze processional cross. The absence of cooking equipment means the refuge was temporary. They'd hung bells around the necks of their children to ward off evil spirits. They had several small knives and one spearhead found at the cave mouth, which is suggestive of hostile threat. The presence of keys shows they intended to go home. The skeletal remains were clustered in small groups, their pots leaning against the cave walls as if to collect water droplets, their cross still standing between bronze communion vessels. None of the 33 skeletons display marks of violence. No funerary practices were discovered upon inspection of the site. It appears they lay down in family groups, unable or unwilling to leave the cave, clay lamp stuttering in the dark. Okay, I'm going to read a more cheerful one. Okay, so this one, it's happy memories for me. I wrote it in Ilfracombe Museum in Devon. Ilfracombe Museum, when I was there, which is quite a long time ago now, might have been redone, was just mad. It's just a crazy museum. It's like the exhibits have just all been sort of hurled in there and left. So yeah, it may have been better curated since, but it's got like East African statues with no context, birds' eggs, an old mangle, tin bats. It's just everything that might be of interest, and I absolutely loved it. So it also had these big, very old, probably 19th century specimen drawers, the big wooden drawers that you can pull out, and you can do that yourself, which is always exciting. So this poem is called Specimen Drawers. A drawer marked wedding cakes, brown patchwork glistening. My eyes adjust. Flat squares of wedding cake packed tight, dark spots of currants, beige icing, twirls of lace, silk flowers. Couples' names and dates on handwritten labels. 1888, 1956. Imagine it packed chokingly in the throat, powdering like brown earth, weevils coiling. A long table, eating and talking and laughing in bone yellow dresses, crunching vitrified marzipan and liver spot raisins before swaying tiers of cakes, mice burrowing. And a ghost band plays, and the first dance is danced forever and ever, souls tethered to a dozen village halls and hotels, the missing slice. Cake should not be an epitaph. It is made to crumble on the tongue, dispersed to cousins and aunts in white napkins, snuck out of tins and off sideboards by the large hands of greedy husbands. Eggs and flour. You cannot carve monuments in cake. You cannot engrave details of contracts. It should not last. A wedding crasher, trophy hunting up and down the Devon coast, evidence for his mates. A vampire groom, remarrying through centuries, knowing the grief to come. A bridesmaid, light on her feet in butterfly colours, put a slice under your pillow and you'll dream of your future husband. And all night, faces flicker like train windows through trees. Okay, the last poem that I will read. The last poem is called Commissioning a Map. And mapping is a very similar thing to curating a museum in that it's about controlling the viewer's gaze. So with that in mind, it's also a process you can apply to yourself, just like you can curate yourself by posting photos on social media. So this poem is called Commissioning a Map, and it's set in Calderdale, where I live. The cartographer and I have had a tiff. I don't appreciate his profession. My slapdash approach to boundaries is troubling. The distance the crow flies is not the same as walking. But that's just fine, because I am more interested in flying than walking. He explains my map is not to scale, that I've mixed northings with eastings, that A and B roads aren't choices made or unmade. A variable of 5 degrees can be the difference between success or failure. But my concerns are not to scale, and furthermore, I want the bridleways unbridled, the best bacon sandwiches mapped, where to go sledging and what time not to walk alone at night. Maps, he explains, don't do temporal. And I say, well, the hydrographer did the whales, spouting beautifully in the ornamental lake. He points out the hydrographer got lost trying to draw an armada at the swimming pool and asks me not to hopscotch on his grid lines. He thinks I'm a slag heap, diss. But he has plotted the silence of the moors, marsh, reeds or saltings, and the gorgeous swoop of the motorway. The cartographer is sick of drawing dragons, and if I have that many dragons, there'll be no cattle left in Calderdale. BS, I say, I'm the one making this map. You're just my technical advisor. You need more than technical, he says, more than advice. It's true that there's a bubble in my compass. Thank you very much, everyone.
That was absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much for reading for us.
Oh, there's little love hearts floating up on my screen. That's really nice.
There we go.
Every single poem that you read, I thought, oh, that one's my favourite. Yep, I remember this. And then you did it again. I did the exact same thing again and kept putting my thumb into the page to say, I really want you to tell me more about that one, and realised I think I would just like you to do that about every single poem, because they're all fantastic. Now, while I would like to ask you so many questions, I don't think that's the reason that we are here this evening. And so we've got lots of questions from other people. The Q&A is open, so if anybody, I see we've got one question in there, and we've had a couple of questions come into the chat. And so if you're both happy to move on to that, I realise, sorry, Charlotte, you stopped reading and I've immediately put us into the Q&A and I've not given Sascha a chance to speak.
Oh, no, Charlotte, you did a tremendous job. That was brilliant. Yeah, well done.
Right then, so let's do some questions. So the first question is from Lizzie Blackburn, who asked, how do you silence your inner critic when writing?
I don't think I do. I think it goes back to the drafting process. I think you often have the inner critic and who says you're writing absolute bollocks, but you are, but no one's going to see it, so it doesn't matter. So I don't silence it. It just chats on, and then I think, oh, hopefully the inner critic will be useful later on in the editing process. So you don't have to show anybody what you've written, right, until you're happy with it. So I just let it chat on and don't worry about it. Don't give it headspace. And then later on when I'm editing, I might listen to it at that point.
Well, I mean, that's a big subject, you know, the inner critic, and it actually stops a lot of people from even beginning to write. So I think I second what Charlotte says, is completely disregard this so-called inner critic, because it's often, you know, trying to sabotage, and it makes you freeze. And I do feel like that whole notion of carrying around notebooks is a good one for that, circumventing the critic, and just, you know, writing no matter what. And handwriting definitely even more so, because it's just easy, so it doesn't give you time to think about it. Write no matter what you think you are doing, because you, in the beginning, you have no idea what you're doing, and even later you still don't have any idea, but other people have told you that you may have some idea, so you're still there, you know, reading your poems. But yeah, disregard completely. Breathe.
That sounds like very wonderful advice. I might have to take that myself when I write absolutely anything. Although I don't think it's going to be as easy as that, though I like the just breathe while you're doing it.
Because the inner critic causes anxiety, and people, this is a huge subject, you know, for me. I've suffered my whole life with so much anxiety, and so it's really hard to overcome. So yeah, you know, it's wellness. dealing with the inner critic is it's part of your own well-being. Could be it's a big subject, but yeah.
I guess like Charlotte said as well, maybe it becomes useful at the point when you actually are trying to be really critical of your work and doing all these different techniques of moving all the lines around on the page and reading backwards and getting thesauruses out.
Yeah, put your editor's hat on. You're gonna have to do that, but nobody says it's going to be easy. Editing your own work can make you want to like jump out a window, frankly. You know.
So we have a question from Sarah Wimbush, who said, "Fabulous, Charlotte, such power. You write a lot about the oppressed and women, often the same thing. Is that a conscious thing?"
I suppose so. Yeah, it just comes up a lot, doesn't it? It's just a lot of it. Yeah, I think it's a conscious thing for sure, but it's not. I think it's not like a subject that I choose necessarily. Like I don't think, oh, this would make a good subject for a poem, because I in fact the opposite, because generally it doesn't. So I have written a lot of very bad poems about this topic, and it's very hard to write a good one about it. And so it is conscious, but it's not a decision I try to make. I try not to make it. And then sometimes you find a way in with the language, you know. So I think, and that's, poetry is really good for writing about difficult subjects, as you know full well, Sarah. So I think that's probably why there are poems about it, because you've managed against the odds to let the language find a way in for you. Yeah, and then it can be good.
That was a fantastic answer. Hopefully Sarah agrees, but I think that was a really great answer. We have a question from, I'm now about to butcher someone's name, I'm really sorry. Chiara, I'm hoping I said that right. With a name like Kyaice, I get that a lot, so I really apologise if I've just messed up your name. But they ask, how do you navigate the business of traditional publishing as opposed to writing poems?
I think Sasha's better qualified to answer that.
Thanks. How do you navigate? Can you please, sorry, just quickly.
Yeah, so how do you navigate the business of traditional publishing as opposed to writing poems?
Oh God, who does? I mean, that's the thing, is that, you know, writing poems is, believe it or not, it's the fun part, even though it feels so painful and anxiety inducing. But the point is to just let your work lead you. So as in, you know, don't get too caught up in like, oh, what should I do? Where should I go? Just allow the work to lead you. And by that, I mean, you know, read other poetry magazines, like go to the poetry library. Now there's, you know, Manchester has one, London has one. Make trips to find out where your poems can go. I like to simplify the process and demystify it quite a lot for my students. And, you know, I do a lot of courses about this as well. And it really is not getting caught up in like, oh, you know, this is a big publisher, or this is a small publisher. I suggest at this point is finding books from like indie publishers, which is basically the heart and soul of poetry. We're very fortunate that there's so many people who choose to make no money in poetry just to support us. So if you have poets that you really like, you know, find out where they're published from, attend readings from that publisher, you know, become part of the community. I've always been published by becoming part of community, you know, going to readings, talking to people, not being scared, because seriously, poetry is not like any other parts of the writing world. It's much less scary. And, you know, you don't really need agents and all this unless you want an agent and you want to be published by, like, your first book to be done by Faber, which, you know, may never happen, frankly. And that's not because you're not a good poet. It's just because they only publish that many people. and there's a huge competition. I would just say don't get into the competition, because it's such a beautiful organic community and there's so many places. And I highly recommend Twitter. I don't really believe, I know people have had problems with Twitter, but I never have. And it's been nothing but great for me as a writer, finding magazines and publishers. So that's as short an answer as I can give, but like I've done a whole course on this subject, so I hope that helps. Yeah. Does that help? Is that helpful?
That sounded like a great answer to me, but hopefully they'll let us know in the chat if that was a helpful answer. They said yes, thank you. So a helpful answer. Now, just before we finish, I realize we are running over. There are, as I said, so many more questions that I'd like to ask you both, but I think sadly in an hour we don't have time for everything. You do both already know this because I already asked you, but I wondered if you had a book that you would maybe recommend to everyone on absolutely any subject that you would like, maybe a book that's going to help them about publishing, or a book just that you love, as a nice way for us to finish this evening.
You first, Charlotte.
Okay, I'm very happy to recommend a book. So the best poetry book that I've read for a long time is by Phoebe Power, who is a York-based poet, and it's called Book of Days. It's published by Carcanet, and it's her second collection. And I wholeheartedly recommend this book to you as a reading experience. It's one long poem in the book. Do not be put off by that, because I promise you that whatever type of poetry you like, somehow I'm sure you will like this book, because it is written with such ease and flow and perfection of phrasing that it's actually an easy read, despite being a full-length book of poetry, and it's beautiful and interesting. So yeah, Phoebe Power, Book of Days would be my recommendation.
That sounds brilliant, thank you. And Sasha?
And that's poetry.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I wanted to try to recommend, a book that might be sort of helpful, but I also have a poetry book. So it's Sylvia Legris, Sylvia, and Legris, Legris, and it's called Garden Physic, Physic. And Sylvia Legris sort of, the things she does with language and also, towards a sort of more like us living in tune with nature and what we can learn from nature. And I'm not explaining it very well, but it's astonishing. Like it's like the poetry I wish I'd read when I began writing. So that's my recommendation.
Another brilliant recommendation. I'm obviously going to end by recommending Accessioning, because I mean, if you haven't already read it, I'm assuming that most people have read it and are joining us because they're already in love with it, but otherwise you need to go and read it. As I said already, I think every single poem, I think somebody in the chat said that every single poem kind of leaves you on edge waiting for the next line and you're surprised by it, and I think that's definitely true. And also it's just, each one becomes your favorite as you go through it and gets harder and harder to decide which one you love the most. So if you haven't already got Accessioning, then why haven't you? You definitely need to.
Thanks, Daisy.
Oh, thanks so much. Yeah, it's been lovely.
Yeah, thank you both for
Give
coming.
a shout out to my sister who sent me this ridiculous t-shirt in the post today.
I love it.
I was destined to wear it today, so. But thank you, Sascha, for agreeing to read with me. It's been a real privilege, and thanks, Kyaice, for like so much work that you put into this book. Like, I really appreciate the hours you've put in.
Thank you, and thank you, Sascha, as well for joining us, and thank you, Charlotte, for your brilliant readings and for making time to be with us this evening.
Oh,
hi everyone. Thank you.
Thank you everyone for joining us.
Thank you.
Thanks for all the lovely comments. Everyone's so nice. Beautiful comments.
Right. Enjoy your weekends, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.